and welcome to Alzheimer Speaks Radio. I'm your host, Lori LeBay, and I'm so excited that you're joining us today. We are going to have a fascinating conversation as usual as we learn from people all around the world at all ages and stages of life. Stay tuned as we shift our dementia care from crisis to comfort.
Here we go. What you think about, you will bring about the mental change. We will.
Well, hi, everyone. Welcome to Alzheimer Speaks. I'm thrilled that you are joining us today. We're going to be talking with Sharon Rogers, who's been a guest of our show before, and she's the CEO of AmyriAD Therapeutics. And she is absolutely marvelous because she talks our talk and is easy to understand. She's going to give us an update on what's going on in research, not only with her company, but globally as well. But before we formally introduce you to her, I'm going to do a couple of shout outs. One, if you're looking for a memory cafe, we have Arthur's Memory Cafe that meets the second and the fourth Wednesday of each month. And that is at 1:00 Central Time. And you can just reach out to me at Lori@alzheimerspeaks.com, and I'll send you a link for that. We usually meet for an hour and a half to 2 hours, and we have people all over the world joining us. That is for people living with dementia and their care partners. Also, if you are in Minnesota, I also do another support group, which meets the last Wednesday of each month at 10 a.m. Central at the Shoreview Community Center. And with that program, the care partners meet in one room, and there's respite for their loved ones in another area. And then if you're going to be in Texas, specifically Amarillo, November 10th, I will be doing a full day workshop for the 17th annual caregiver conference for the Area Agency on Aging. And you can just reach out to them at 806-331-2227 for more information on that. I'd also like to direct you to alzheimerspeaks.com. If you go there, we have one full section that is just full of free educational resources. So please tap into that, share that with others. You can also access our book, Betty the Bald Chicken, Lessons in How to Care. And last, I want to give a shout out to Dementia Map, which is our global resource directory. And you can just go to dementiamap.com. So with no further ado, let's meet Sharon. So Sharon, as usual, I am thrilled to have you back with us today. You are the easiest person to interview. You speak our language on really technical stuff, and I so appreciate your skill levels on so many levels. So thanks for joining us today. I know you're busy.
Thanks, Lori. I'm always happy to be with you because this is a real opportunity to reach patients, to reach caregivers, and all the people in our Alzheimer community that we really hope to be able to speak to regularly.
Well, thank you. I'm going to have you, if you don't mind, introduce yourself to our guests. You can do a much better job than I can.
That's nice of you to say, but we'll go for it. I am Dr. Sharon Rogers, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of AmyriAD Therapeutics. I've been working in the Alzheimer's disease area essentially most of my professional career. I started out in the pharmaceutical industry in general, and at my third company that I was at, there was a focus on Alzheimer's disease, and I had this amazing experience of developing the drug Aricept, which has been #1 in the world in the standard of care since it was introduced back in 1996. One thing you can say about when you work in the Alzheimer's disease area is there's no other therapeutic area that touches you quite as much. And so I have always looked over the years to find places to continue to pursue Alzheimer's disease, to find new ways of helping patients and their related caregiving family. And that's what I'm still doing now. And at AmyriAD Therapeutics, we are focused primarily on improving cognition and improving patient function, because these are the two main drivers that control how much additional care is needed for the patient in the home, or ultimately time to nursing home placement, which I think all of us would like to delay as long as possible.
Oh, for sure. You know, I never knew when Aricept came out, and I guess my mom must have been one of the first few on that drug. You know, she was misdiagnosed for 10 years from like 86 to about 96.
Mm-hmm.
And then was on Aricept, and we just swore by it as a family. I mean, we really felt that bought her a lot of time, and it was wonderful. So thank you for your work on that. I can't wait to hear what's going on today. But first, I always ask every one of our guests if they don't mind sharing if they've been personally touched by dementia in their own family or circle of friends.
I hadn't been touched within my own family and circle of friends until this year. And this year, a very close colleague of mine, someone that I've known for well over 30 years, had an attack of probably not Alzheimer's disease, but a massive, multifaceted, rapid onset dementia. And it was very difficult to watch. And it was very difficult to know that I could do nothing for him. As much as I wanted to, and as much as the family was calling and hoping that there would be something that could be done, there was nothing to add, nothing to change the course of his disease. And he died this past summer. And it was shocking, and it was very challenging. Very challenging.
Wow.
Because I just watched that person fade away from me.
And it's amazing that you haven't been touched prior. It's because it's becoming so much more common. You're hearing, it's rare when you hear someone who hasn't been touched with it. Does that give you a little bit more oomph to what you're doing? I mean, I know you've always been passionate.
I don't think it gave me more oomph, because you're right that from my very first experience working in the Alzheimer's disease area, once you get into that, once you understand the patients and the families, there's no going back. You're very much committed to it. But it does make me want to look a little bit more broadly at what other companies are doing, and to see if there aren't other pathways that could come in to the same pathway I'm working on, so that combination therapies are more readily available. Because for people with more complex dementias with other factors that are contributing to it, there's very little effort placed upon dealing with those types of dementias. One is because they're very challenging, and so the failure rate of therapies is quite difficult. But two, I don't think we're necessarily asking all the right questions yet on how to approach dealing with these more complex dementias. But it does not mean that they don't need therapies as much as any other patient with a more uncomplicated dementia. If anything, they need them more.
Oh, I agree. And, over time, I mean, just since I've been in this space since 2009, things have changed so much in terms of how people are diagnosed, or what their diagnosis is mm-hmm. changing, because you guys keep learning more and more about these diseases. And, I think there's going to be findings of more people like my mom upon her death. We did a biopsy of her brain, and the whole time we were told it was Alzheimer's, and all of a sudden it was Alzheimer's, Lewy body, and Parkinson's. And mm-hmm. that seems, when I'm talking with people living with the disease, there seems to be so much overlap in symptoms, and I can see where it's really hard to sort out, because we'd like to categorize it, and we'd like to just have one, who wants the trifecta, when it comes to this game. So it's very interesting. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk about today was, we seem to be in this age where things are picking up and moving faster, and some people can look at it as a golden age. Some people are looking at who's behind the curtain and being the wizard with these diseases, and what's really happening out there. What do you foresee, in the next decade with treatments?
I think that the recent successes have created a good space to work in. Investors who really fund the vast majority of early stage work. A lot of folks think that big pharma is funding a lot of early stage work, and actually they're not. Most of the early stage work, they're small startup biotechs, a lot like mine, and they're looking at discovery candidates that sort of examine a number of different factors in Alzheimer's disease. And that's funded through venture capitalists. And all the failures really dampened the enthusiasm of venture capitalists to invest in this early work. And I'd say, if anything that is happening now, the successes of Leqembi with Eisai, a little bit with Aduhelm, the recent data that's been released from Lilly with their project that's also very similar to these other two drugs, that has made people realize that sometimes the path is long, but there is a success in there if you're willing to continue to invest and work for it. So we're seeing money loosen up. And whenever you see money loosen up for early stage research, the major beneficiaries of that are the patients, because that means that people are going to be a little bit more resourceful and a little bit more innovative in how they look at treating the disease. So now we can start going into other contributors to Alzheimer's disease, like in your mom's case. Let's go back to that for a minute. So there were Lewy bodies, yes. A bit of Parkinson's also. And now some really recent work has talked about mitochondrial dysfunction in all of these neurodegenerative diseases and protein accumulation with all of these diseases. So instead of just looking at whatever is the most obvious, we can start to look at some of the things that are a little bit more subtle and look at things that we can do. Sometimes they're lifestyle changes, sometimes they're dietary changes, sometimes they're social changes, but oftentimes they're going to be small molecule susceptible paths where you can get in early, start manipulating these pathways, and hopefully hang on to cognition, hang on to function, and delay disease progression. So the money to do that is very important, because these things really aren't for free. The success rate is low. And so people have to be willing to investing knowing that they may not get a return on that particular investment, but with the idea that we're going to learn more about Alzheimer's disease. And in the end, everybody wins when we do that.
You know, I have a question, because there's this kind of cure versus care, and I want them mixed. I want care for people, but I want a cure, just like everyone else. Do you ever think that we'll come to a day where a trial actually combines not only the medication, but the social care piece? Because I think, I really think that the two of them together can make a huge difference on a lot of different levels. One is kind of that molecule, it's really doing something in the body, but the other is that social connection and feeling of belonging. Mm-hmm. And I think and I'm not a medical person, I'm just a frustrated daughter who got into this, but I really think that there is a lot of power in the belief of that something is doing you good, in terms of what that does to our chemistry in our body and things. Do you ever think there'll be a day where it says, we want you to take this medication, but we also want you to partner? And I don't care if it's a memory cafe, an art class, a walking, doing something physical, but just some kind of combination for social interaction.
I think it's important. And I think it's already happening, just not so much in the United States. In the United States, our trials do seem to be more purpose-driven to get medications to the marketplace. And in the United States, we do that in a way that is really unsurpassed. So it's quick, it's efficient for the most part. Where you will see this type of work going on is more in Europe, and primarily in the Nordic countries. And there actually is a large published study from the Finnish government. And in this case, they support this work because they realize, as a national healthcare provider, that it's in their best interest to find every possible way to ensure that a patient has the most successful outcomes to their health. At the end of the day, it's going to be less expensive for the government. It's going to be better for the patients. It's going to be better for their caregivers, who are greatly impacted, and their health is impacted by Alzheimer's disease. And they actually are putting out some fantastic work. And so, yes, art therapy is useful. Yes, social interaction is useful. Yes, even dancing, sending them out and going to dance classes has been incredibly helpful. But the standard for demonstrating that something works is a little bit more flexible when you're looking at adjuvant outcome measures and adding things in. So it's a little bit more flexible. You can go with trends. You can go with correlations between social activities and disease progression. Whereas in a drug development trial, you're limited to a very hard and fast p-value and tough statistics. And so the two are not necessarily always going to work well together. But there's quite a bit in the European literature that I think is useful. It provides a lot of hope. And I think the more we can keep people busy, the better. The more we can stimulate their minds and their bodies, the better. And if you look at the way we've spoken with people and advising them on many chronic diseases like high blood pressure, diabetes, we always talk about lifestyle changes. And for some conditions, it's very difficult to get people to actually do these lifestyle changes. They don't want to change their diet. They don't necessarily want to exercise more. They like their life the way that it is. But when you talk about social interventions, these are much more fun, and people do like to do them. And I think that we can probably publicize those a little bit more often. A guy named Peter Whitehouse, who was at the Cleveland Clinic for many years, Peter was one of the first to actually, flip completely and say, don't look at this as a disease, look at it as a way of living. Mm-hmm. And I do tend to agree with him on that, although I do still believe it's a disease that needs pharmacologic intervention. I believe there's a lot we can do socially to improve lives of patients, caregivers, families in general, and keep people at home longer. When we can keep people at home longer, that in and of itself has been shown to delay time to terminal care.
That's interesting. I wasn't aware that they were doing something overseas with that. I mean, I guess I was looking at something that was really tied together, and I can see where even if the doctors would start giving out information for social connections, but they don't. They're all so paranoid in terms of doing that. And I don't know. I mean, I've tried really hard to get into the clinics to, talk about even Dementia Map, which is a global resource directory that we're building slowly. But the things that are in there are stuff that no one's ever heard of before. And they're just shocked. And yet they're sprinkled all over the place. And there's so many more resources. And I think it would make the doctors feel better too. But I think there's just got to be a way to be able to tag team those two. And I think we'll all see better results going forward with that. Plus, I think one of the things that I hear, and please tell me if I'm wrong, but it's hard to get people in clinical trials. Well, if you're supporting them with some social mechanisms, that chitter chatter is going to spread, and they're more likely to step in to those trials because they know someone who's working that. And I haven't really seen that angle pushed to the extent that I think it could be effective.
I agree with you, but I also understand why that's not likely to happen. Because in a trial setting, these outcome measures are very tricky and very sensitive. And so you like to try to control all the variables possible. And there are going to be some patients who are not able to go and participate in these more social interactions because they don't have the care resources to get them to those events to help them participate. And whenever you add in new variables in the way you're treating a patient, you tend to create a lot of what we call noise around the signal about whether or not the drug works. It's a complicating variable. And so I can see why pharmaceutical companies in particular are not likely to go in that direction. So that is where I think that we need to expand what we do as a country into more of these social interventions. Again, you're going to see more of this in Europe than in the US, where national healthcare services are providing for patients. They see the benefits. Our own healthcare system is really chopped up. Even CMS doesn't talk about and advocate for social services and things. They look at that in a slightly different way. And if someone is not in CMS, there's virtually no hope that they're, whether it's a healthcare maintenance organization like Kaiser, United, Humana, Blue Cross, Blue Shield, whatever, that's not going to be their emphasis. And I would say that in the US in particular, it's very difficult for a patient with Alzheimer's disease to maintain their agency. And that to me is frustrating, because that dignity that you have from having agency over self, when that gets lost, it's very depressing for the patients. And these small things with social interactions that we do can help patients hold on to their agency longer.
Yep.
It's not looked at as a codable intervention.
Which is interesting because, when a person is depressed, when they don't feel they have their independence, that's going to affect, that's kind of that noise too, on a different level. And yet that's not taken into consideration. The other side is, but that side really isn't. And again, that's just how I perceive it. And I understand, you've got to have the quality control and things, but it would even be interesting to see them test or step into the space of, okay, this is just the pill. This is the pill and the social interaction, and see what the differences are there to move forward. I just don't know how we're really going to tackle getting these social benefits to people when it's so clouded. And I just find that really sad, because they say time after time after time what a difference it makes for them. And people even, you brought up dance and stuff. I do a thing called Dementia in the Arts, where we interview people and they show their artwork. And there's this theme that goes through, no matter if they're painting or sketching or doing jewelry or writing poems or whatever it might be, that they get in the zone. And when they're in the zone, they feel calmer, and their symptoms, they just kind of disseminate for a little while. And they, who doesn't want that? And then if you power that with a medication that can be progressing that even more, I just look at the whole quality of life piece with that. But I'll drop that, because I didn't want to focus on that too much. But that's just one of my pet peeves of what I'm seeing and hearing over and over, and what people are wanting out there. But let's talk about, there's so many different types of complex diseases out there. It used to just be the only word we ever heard was Alzheimer's, and then all of a sudden dementia, was born, and people were talking, put it under the umbrella, and there's all these different types. Do you know how many types there really are? I never seem to get a straight answer on that. And then there's the mixture of, some people have more than one. Do we really know? I mean, because it just seems so fluid out there.
I like starting with the last part of your question and then working backwards. Do we really know? And the answer to that is, in my opinion, no, we don't really know. And I would be willing to argue with anyone who was willing to say that we know, because we are learning more every day about how complex this illness is. If you think back even to the last time we spoke, we were talking about the fact that very few people have their brains autopsied when they die. And plaques and tangles were considered to be the causative agent of Alzheimer's disease. And I emphasize, there are people who go to the grave with massive plaque and tangle load, and they're cognitively intact, completely and totally. And yet there are other people who die with very severe dementia with a low plaque and tangle burden. And what's the difference? What is the resilience factor here? And I think that's when we get into some of these other conditions that we're just learning about over time, and that we will continue to learn about. Lewy bodies are certainly one. Mitochondrial dysfunction is another. And Parkinson's disease also, they're actually linking Parkinson's disease development to mitochondrial dysfunction, genetic mitochondrial dysfunction. Protein processing, and we've talked about that also. We accumulate a lot of proteins, not just beta amyloid and tau. And when we're accumulating these dysfunctional, no longer needed proteins, one, it sort of clogs up the works in our brain and elsewhere in our bodies. It's all about aging, accumulating proteins that are no longer helpful to us. But also it shuts off the apparatus for creating new functional proteins that we need. And the new functional proteins will not be created effectively as long as we have a backlog of dysfunctional proteins we need to clean out. So those have probably been two major areas. The mitochondrial dysfunction, this is why there is now a large body of evidence that shows that various agents like metformin that modulate glucose intake and glucose processing, which in turn goes into the mitochondria for oxidative phosphorylation, that when you can monitor or what I want to say, modulate this process more effectively, you actually are able to enhance cognition and function in Alzheimer patients. And so I think as we get older, we have more mitochondrial dysfunction. It is just part of aging. Some people, it's going to be worse than others, just like some people accumulate more proteins than others, and some people respond differently. So every year we're learning a little bit more about all the factors that sort of come into play in this giant cascade of events that end up producing the symptoms not only of Alzheimer's disease, but also of other neurodegenerative diseases. So it's going to be a matter of identifying which ones are most important for cognition and function. In a Parkinson's patient, which one is most important for movement disorder? In a patient with ALS, which ones are the most important for losing muscle tone and function? And we'll continue to work on this, and we'll continue to make these little baby steps in understanding. But the root of all of these problems is actually quite similar. So do I think there's a cure in the near term? No, I don't think there's a cure. Do I think we can learn new ways to address each of these issues and improve lives of patients in an incremental way? Most definitely. And so this is why I'm very much into combination therapies. We don't have a magic bullet. We have to approach this from as many ways possible. And with other chronic illnesses, we have just accepted that this is the path. But we got off on sort of the wrong track with Alzheimer's disease and plaques and tangles. And once we were on that track, it was very difficult to get us off of it. Now we're finally going to a more divergent way of looking at things. And I think that that's going to be good news for patients and carers in the future.
Well, that's really hopeful. I like an honest opinion. There's so many times when I think people feel, they're pushed that this is the silver bullet, and then they feel let down. And that's been kind of over and over and over again. And I think it's very realistic. I do think this is a baby disease. It's been around 100 years, but really that's not a long time. And, it's really unfolding. One of the things that gets me a little frustrated, and I don't know if you guys run into this with your trials, but I run into a lot of people that are diagnosed, let's say with Alzheimer's, and then all of a sudden it's Lewy body. And now they're saying it's mild cognitive impairment, and some of these people can barely talk. I mean, you can visually see how difficult it is for them to interact. And to me, that's like way beyond mild cognitive impairment. And they feel that way too. And again, I'm not a doctor, but how do you really know who you're getting because all these doctors seem to have, and I know they're probably not supposed to, but they have different impressions of what these diseases are and what they label them. I mean, that I would say is the public's perception, and what they've been through in terms of change of diagnosis. What do you say to that? And does that affect your trials?
It affects trials to some extent, because a big part of a trial is making sure you have the right patient population. But again, I work in the symptom management area, which is cognition and function. I'm not looking at removing beta amyloid plaques or tangles or tau or other types of things like that. For those folks, they need to have a very defined group of people, because their target is that protein they're trying to remove. That's their target. And so if they don't work with that target, then they can't answer the scientific question about, does my drug remove the protein that I am hypothesizing it removes? And does that removal result in some benefit one way or another for the patient? By looking at symptom management, cognition, and function, I'm not burdened by these other issues as much. And so it doesn't matter quite so much what these other issues are. I do want to make sure they have diagnosable Alzheimer's disease, that there's not some type of other corrective situation that could be taken, say with a B12 deficiency or some type of other disease that can be reversed in another way. But with cognition and function, do I improve it regardless of beta amyloid, regardless of tau, regardless of other issues? Can I improve their cognition and function? That's the question I want to answer. So with our company, we look at a fairly broad population using standard NI and CDS criteria for Alzheimer's disease. We do not specify a beta amyloid load or a tau load or anything of that nature. We try to rule out other treatable causes of dementia. And that's a little bit different because we're taking basically almost all comers. Mm-hmm. And a broader swath of patients. And so I think in your mom's case, Aricept did work extremely well for her. But your mom wouldn't have been able to come into a lot of the trials for the beta amyloid agents because she has a more complicated case.
Yeah, which we didn't know till she was dead.
Yeah.
I mean, that was never diagnosed earlier on. Well, Sharon, this has just been such a great conversation. For those who are just popping into the show right now, you might want to rewind. We are talking with the CEO of AmyriAD Therapeutics. And next, we're going to be talking about symptoms management and how does that reduce the burden for care partners as well as the patient. I think this is just a really going to be a really interesting conversation, but we've covered some really, I think, great points in this first half. So again, if you're just popping in midstream, rewind it, and then, feel free to go to their website too, which is AmyriADtherapeutics.com. You can also find them on Twitter and LinkedIn. So Sharon, let's talk about this symptom management piece and how that could possibly reduce the burdens placed on those that are caring for people diagnosed. How do you see that, falling into place?
Caregiver burden and care burdens, whether it's skilled nursing care, nursing home care, however you want to describe it, that is actually the major driver of cost in Alzheimer's disease. When you consider the really short period of time that people are alive once they have been diagnosed, it is the most expensive chronic disease. Other chronic diseases are actually more expensive because they encompass a larger portion of someone's life, say chronic hypertension, heart failure, diabetes. Those are all quite expensive to manage. But in Alzheimer's disease, it's a shorter period of time and it's very, very intense. So the longer that you can maintain some level of independent function or keep someone at home, starting with no nursing care, no assistance, to a little bit more assistance, to skilled nursing care in the home, and then later movement to a nursing home, the less expense you have both for the caregiver, and this is emotionally, mentally, physically, professionally. You reduce that burden tremendously. If they can rely on a patient to be able to dress themselves, to make a sandwich for lunch, to not wander away from the house, that's a huge lift for them to be able to maintain the patient at home. The same thing with when skilled nursing care needs to come in. The more you can delay that time, because people can still toilet for themselves and take showers and brush their teeth and do all the things that they need to do. They do know how to continue to feed themselves. That's helpful. And when you can avoid nursing home placement, that is the best, because that is when you're going to lose who you love. And that's heartbreaking for everyone. And don't make any mistake about it. Patients know when they're going to nursing homes, and it's hard for them too. So we rely on caregivers. We have the number of hours of unpaid care. It's roughly, last year, or 2022, it was $305 million in the US alone. Unpaid care, the value of unpaid care. So caregivers who are not going to work, they're staying home instead. We have fewer caregivers now, and yet the population of elderly people who are inclined to have dementia is expanding. We used to think it was going to double by 2050. We now know it's going to triple by 2050. And yet at the same time, birth rates have been lower over the last few decades. You may even remember when there was a big movement towards zero population growth. And that has impacted the number of caregivers who are available. So when there are fewer caregivers available providing unpaid care, that means we need more skilled nursing payments, which is also extraordinarily expensive. I don't want the cost of care to ever interfere with the quality of a patient's care. And I am very concerned that this is what we are hurtling towards unless we can find other ways of improving cognition and improving function. So let's say, for example, with AmyriAD's lead candidate, we know that we improve cognition, and we know that we doubled functional improvement in these patients over Aricept alone. You have your own experience with knowing how well Aricept does at improving patient function and keeping them in the home. Well, picture doubling that, which is what our drug did in phase 2. That you can't even put a value on that, really, but people will look to do so. And I think that this is what we want. We want people to have autonomy for as long as possible. We want to keep people at home as long as possible, but we don't want that to be an undue burden on families and on the healthcare system in general. And how you do that is by managing symptoms. The first symptoms that you can manage are improving cognition and preserving global independent function. In later stages of the disease, you'll also want to start improving symptoms like agitation, delusions, hallucinations, sundowning, wandering. And those are a different group of drugs that you can administer to deal with those symptoms later. But the longer you improve cognition and function, actually, the longer it's going to take you to where you get to the point where you need to deal with agitation and delusions and wandering and these other things that ultimately end up in resulting in nursing home placement. Toileting and hygiene are things that families are willing to contend with, but they can't deal with a patient who is agitated and aggressive and delusional. And then you have to move to nursing home placement. And there is quite a lot of work done. Again, I'll go back to the Europeans because they see the value in this a little bit more than US healthcare providers do. There was a study that was called the Domino study. And it was referred to the Domino study because with dominoes, when you push over the first one and they start clicking down in a little line and all the dominoes are falling in place, they were referring to the fact that when you start losing certain functions, independent functions, you're on the path to going to a nursing home. And so how do you slow it down? And what they found out in that particular study in a group of patients who had severe dementia, but were still living at home, still home-based, these were patients in England and Scotland, that when they kept them on Aricept, they were able to keep them at home longer. On average, already with severe dementia, more than 2 to 3 years, they were home longer. And they did what's called a Kaplan-Meier survival curve. And what this curve does is it basically plots someone from being at home all the way to nursing home admission. And so there is a curve for patients who are receiving no Aricept, and you can measure how quickly they go to nursing home. And this was on average less than a year for these severely demented patients who were in the community. When Aricept was added, the curve for the Aricept treated patients versus the non-treated patients did not converge until almost 4 years later. So that means a lot of these patients were still at home and still able to stay with their families and still able to have time with them and not go to nursing home placement. Once patients are in a nursing home, the route to death is relatively quick. It's just you're just pulling the rug out from under these patients when they're no longer at home. And so if the patient is demented enough that they don't know what's going on around them, it's a little bit easier to manage. But many times these patients do know what's going on around them. They simply can't be managed at home. So you basically pull the rug out from under them. All that is familiar is gone. All that they see every day, whether it's their own bedroom, their own kitchen, their own backyard, all these things are gone. And so they tend to decompensate fairly quickly. So the idea, again, keep them home as long as you can, enjoy the time with them for as long as you can. And drugs like Aricept, which are symptom management treatments, do exactly that. So I think it's a big deal. And I think we want to add on as many additional therapies as possible to preserve cognition. And when you preserve cognition, you're going to improve function.
Yep. Well, I really appreciate you talking about all the different variables that, reducing the burden, of care makes, because again, it's financial, it's stress. I mean, it's the physicalness of caring for somebody. I mean, it's a lot, and people don't even, I think, break down all of those aspects. When they're doing the job, they just feel overwhelmed. I also wanted to ask you, for young scientists coming up, what advice do you have for them in terms of stepping into this space and, looking at developing therapeutics?
I always advise a couple of things. One is don't accept the easy answers because they're likely not going to be true. You have to, easy answers are definitely what people like to have when answering scientific questions. They're very rarely going to be the ultimate answer. So you have to look at everything fairly skeptically, which I have always done. But the other thing is to not be discouraged by that. When you don't get an easy win, because the disease is complex, don't let that discourage you. Instead, let that be your fire that keeps you going. Let that be the reason why you want to do the next study a little bit better, why you want to tweak the design and maybe measure a couple of things you hadn't thought about measuring for. Look at the whole patient and think, okay, this is a little bit more of a puzzle than I thought it was going to be. So challenge yourself to find another way to look at, to ask the question, to answer the question. And then you'll find that there's a lot of mental stimulation and a lot of scientific reward that comes from doing work of that caliber. So never take the easy answers. Never be discouraged when the answer shows it's going to be a little bit more difficult or a lot more difficult than you thought it was going to be. I've been working in this area for over 35 years. I've never been discouraged. I've always just found the questions interesting, the science interesting, the patients and their families compelling. And now we're at this point where it's actually been quantified that if we can improve symptom management, the value over the next 20 years is estimated to be $2.5 trillion. So when you're looking for agencies like CMS to support treating patients, you can say to them $2.5 trillion in patient care costs can be mitigated by just doing what you can to improve symptoms.
Yeah, that's a powerful number. And, I love that you're hopeful and you really look at everything as a learning tool, that comes your way and pushing forward. Now, I know there's a big conference coming up, and does that make you even more optimistic in terms of gathering with everybody around the world?
Yes, it does. This will be the Clinical Trials in Alzheimer's Disease Conference. And I know that there are a couple of companies that are going to be presenting some major top-line results. At last year's meeting, that was when Eisai presented the results from lecanemab, Leqembi, which were just absolutely exquisite in the work quality. So Lilly is going to be presenting the work from donanemab. Again, this is just another beta amyloid treatment, and but it's still a step forward in understanding the disease because donanemab works a little bit differently than lecanemab, which works differently from aducanumab. So they all have a slightly different tweak to how they work, and it will be a good learning experience. But there are going to be about 4 other companies that are supposed to have some major top-line results as far as mechanism of action. And I'm looking forward to seeing that as well. And we're also going to hear from regulators who are looking at some different ways of diagnosing Alzheimer's disease. I think probably with these protein modulating treatments in mind, but it's going to be the first time that that's been discussed in public since 1985, when the original ideas about how to diagnose came about. And it should be interesting. So it's going to be fabulous. And I'll get to see many of my colleagues. Like I said, 35 years in the business. So yes, you have colleagues that become like family.
Oh, wonderful. Well, you'll have to let us know what you find from the conference. In wrapping up, I hope our audience has found this as informative as I have. Sharon Rogers with AmyriAD Therapeutics, you are just amazing. And again, I appreciate your time with us today. I ask our listeners all the time to like, click, and share our episodes, not because I'm chasing numbers. That's not who I am. But I want you to join us and be a giver of hope. People out there need this information. It's a simple, no cost, nanosecond thing you can do to push this episode out to people who might need this. There are people in your sphere that you don't even know are dealing with this or are contemplating it might be creeping into my family or myself. And we've got to make this stuff accessible and comfortable for people to be able to find. And that's a really easy way to do that. So be a giver of hope, like, click, and share, and just spread the word. We really appreciate you all being part of the community here. And don't forget to go to AmyriAD Therapeutics website. It's just AmyriADtherapeutics.com. And you can also find them on LinkedIn and Twitter. Thank you again, Sharon. Any last comment that you want to make before we close out?
Yes, I want to go back to what you just said to your audience and implore your audience to listen to your advice. Because in point of fact, most people do not get diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease until they are in the moderate stages because they simply feel like there's no hope. They simply are not aware of treatments that might be available to them. And Lori, what you're doing by raising awareness can ensure that patients actually get in for diagnosis earlier, that they can get some symptom management treatment sooner, and that their lives can be more rewarding. There is ample evidence that giving a symptom management treatment does delay time to nursing home. So listen to Lori, get involved, make sure that you understand that there is hope. And Lori, as always, it's just been fabulous talking with you.
Well, thank you. And one last plug, visit alzheimerspeaks.com. Go to our free educational resources. You'll find out about Dementia Map. You'll find out about Dementia Chats and Dementia Arts and the radio show. Those are all platforms that people with dementia can actually participate in. We want to raise their voice, raise their profile, as well as families and professionals. There's so much we can do together. And I personally don't think we can make sustainable change if we're not inclusive. So reach out to me. I'd love to talk to you and help in any fashion that I can. Have a wonderful week, everyone. Bye-bye.
Hi, everyone. This is Meredith from the Senior Fitness with Meredith podcast, where I discuss all things for seniors, from fitness, your health and wellness journeys, how to be all over strong and beyond. I also have my mini podcast called Motivation with Meredith. It's a great, quick motivational pick-me-up for your days. Join me, listen now, search for Senior Fitness with Meredith on your favorite podcast platform.